Okay, great. It looks like we are recording. So thank you all again for joining the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance for our surveillance cameras inside of shelters run by SCVA's Considerations and Complications webinar on June 30th, 2020. We would like to just welcome you for this opportunity to talk about this very important issue. And I'll ask Kristen to just move to the next slide. The Action Alliance, just want to give you a little bit about us, is Virginia's leading voice on sexual and domestic violence. You can see we have all of these very diverse programs that we run, including our Red Flag campaign on campuses, our UPLC program, which is the Underserved Populations Leadership Learning Collaborative, the Project for the Empowerment of Survivors, which is our legal advocacy program, the Virginia statewide hotline, and our LGBTQ partner abuse and sexual assault helpline, VADATA, our statewide data collection system, which is the first, and as far as I know, the only of its kind statewide sexual domestic violence data collection system across the country. So a lot of programs here that we do, and we are very excited to be that leading voice on sexual and domestic violence in Virginia. Go next slide.
Just really quickly, I'd like to add that since slides will be shared back to folks, once you are able to see this, you can always click through to any of these logos and you can get more information from our websites.
Thank you, Kristen. And just to go over this again, I'm your presenter today. I'm Amanda Cole, the Data Systems and Evaluation Director here at the Action Alliance. My work includes understanding confidentiality and providing a lot of technical assistance on that. And so one of the areas that I have done a lot of research on is confidentiality within shelters and how that applies to VAWA. And then these camera systems, we got some information from our national technical assistance provider, and so we did some more in-depth research at how that correlates to information within our SDVAs here in Virginia. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to start by talking about the rise of security cameras. As you all probably have guessed, there is a very significant rise of security cameras in the US. We're outpacing China and the UK in security cameras per person individually. So we actually, have this. There was a study done to show that the United States has about 15.28 cameras per 100 individuals, and we were followed by China with the 14.36, and then the United Kingdom had vastly lower number of cameras per individual, 100 individuals, 7.5. So there's an estimate that there's 20% of US households that have security cameras inside their homes, and that was back in 2016. That's the latest estimate that we could find. But with falling prices of these in-home cameras and the ease of use, and if you think about, companies like Comcast and ADT and Nest and the Ring, all of those companies are offering internal and external cameras, and they're really easy to use, really easy to set up. It's highly likely that this number has increased significantly. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk about the main takeaway that I want you all to get from this presentation, and that's that, our professional commitment to privacy and survivor control over their own information and how it's collected, maintained, and shared is paramount, right? And so when we are talking and thinking about what we're doing as a profession, we have to think about not just the law. We want to follow the law, and it's very important that we follow the law, that we follow the Violence Against Women's Act. But it's also about returning power and control to survivors, so that survivors are in charge of their own information, including their images and recordings. And we noted here that it's never advisable to use audio or video, or to audio or video record a survivor without his or her consent, because that person's recorded image could really be considered personally identifying information and subject to federal law and state protections. So you really want to think about that as you were going in. So that's really about the spirit of VAWA. It's thinking about what is personally identifying information, who controls that, and in our case, it always should be the survivor who controls that information. Let's go to the next slide. So as you're looking at this, I want you to ask yourself, and feel free to put this in the chat as we're going through this list. The question I want you to ask is, as you're looking at this list and as I'm talking, are there other reasons that shelters may want to install cameras inside or outside of a shelter? And the list that we came up with around, why do shelters want to install security cameras? Well, there's a feeling of safety and security, right? Having cameras, especially having cameras that video record, that means that if something happens, then you can identify who's responsible. Monitoring property, again, it's a deterrent for folks who may want to do something. So thinking through, like, how do we take care of our property? Maybe having those security cameras there will deter folks and also identify folks who would do damage to the property. Maybe you want to monitor people and who may be coming and going. Maybe there's a need for evidence collection. Maybe you're trying to ensure compliance with laws and rules that protect the shelter. Maybe you're trying to protect children. Those are all really valid reasons that you would want security cameras. And we know there are good intentions whenever shelters install or consider installing cameras inside a place where people are living. And I just want to say, I have a home security system with a camera in my home, and I know that offers some protection. So once I came home to a door open and I couldn't figure out what happened. So it turns out that my dog sitter had just left it open, but it was really comforting to be able to review the recording and to know that no one had entered my home. You might have installed or even considered installing cameras, like I said, to collect this evidence for survivors in case someone that they are fleeing shows up or tries to intimidate them. And oftentimes there's a reaction to something that maybe scares us, and that's why we're choosing to install cameras inside of a shelter or even outside of a shelter too. But are there other reasons that you all have thought of that you would want to put security cameras up, or have we covered those pretty thoroughly? I'm just looking to the chat to see if anybody's put any answers there. Well, I don't see anything added, so we'll go on to the next slide, but if you think of anything, we can come back.
And I'd like to encourage folks, if it's easier for them to unmute and say something verbally, then I can always put it in the chat myself for folks who prefer to see something visually.
Of course. Thank you for that. So we'll go on to the next slide. And again, if you all want to come back to it, that's fine too. So I want to talk a little bit about why we do not recommend surveillance cameras to be inside of a shelter, because there are a lot of unintended consequences that can do more harm than good. So let's go to the next slide. When we're thinking about recording in Virginia, there are legal ways, and I know we have somebody on here from California, so this may or may not apply to you, and I would encourage you to look up the laws in your state, because this is really important. But I'm going to speak to from the Virginia standpoint. Virginia is a one-party consent state for audio recordings. So in other words, as long as one party to the conversation knows that it's being recorded, it's lawful to record. Again, that's audio only, that's voice recording only. But video, and that's only video, not with voices, those video recordings are treated differently. So Virginia only criminalizes video recordings for adults when the person knowingly is captured in a state of undress and where that person had a reasonable expectation of privacy. So for example, if a person were to place a video camera in a bathroom in their home and they were to capture a video image of an unknowing, non-consenting person's genitals, this would be a criminal violation. However, in Virginia, it's not unlawful to video record someone in an area where they do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy, such as a public sidewalk or a parking lot. So there's some arguments about this too. Like it's arguable that this protection extends to places within a private residence where a person could not be said to have reasonable expectation of privacy too, like a kitchen or a living room that's shared by multiple people. But there's not really clear case law on that. And I'm not an attorney, so I can't speak to what the arguments would be. But we do know that there's not real clear. There's some arguments about it, but there's not real clarity around it. I will say that video that includes audio, the case law is completely unclear, and we don't know what the courts would do with that. Child pornography laws are different and they're outside the scope of this discussion. So that's completely different, and there's very specific laws that go into child pornography, and again, outside the scope of this discussion. So let's go to the next slide. We are going to talk a little bit about child pornography because it is important to this discussion, though. So there's a from the DOJ website about child pornography. This is from section 2256, Title 18, United States Code. It defines child pornography as any visual depiction of sexually explicit conduct involving a minor, and that's someone under 18 years old. So visual depictions include photographs, videos, digital or computer-generated images indistinguishable from an actual minor, and images created, adapted, or modified but appear to depict an identifiable actual minor. This is undeveloped film, undeveloped videotape, and electronically stored data that can be converted into visual image of child pornography are also deemed illegal visual depictions under federal law. Notably, the legal definition of sexually explicit conduct does not require that an image depict a child engaging in sexual activity, and that's really important to note. So a picture of a naked child may constitute illegal child pornography. It is sufficient if it is sufficiently sexually suggestive. So if you have a picture of a naked child that is stored in your database, if it's sufficiently sexually suggestive, according to federal investigators or the court, it could be considered child pornography. So if a naked kid is running around in a shelter and is recorded on video, the shelter may now be in possession of child pornography under this code, even if you did not intend that to happen. So this is really important to think about, that the benefit of camera surveillance in a shelter is likely not outweighed by the risk of inadvertently capturing video of children that may violate federal child pornography laws. And that's just something that we have to consider as we're operating shelters. So let's go to the next slide. We also want to think about how these cameras can be used as a tool for abusers. So for example, an abuser may be seeking to prove that taking children to a shelter was not acting in the best interest during a custody case. So what if an abuser were to find out the video footage, or find out about video footage and try to subpoena that video of their children in the shelter? And what if some judge decides that's okay? This could really be harmful to survivors, and your agency really doesn't want to be put in that position. This is something that we all have to think about in this day and age, when we know that abusers are using the courts as a tool for abuse, and they are constantly putting survivors through this. If they found out, if they wanted to try to gain custody, if they wanted to try to coerce the survivor into coming back, how could they use this as a tool? We don't want to put our survivors in that position. So let's go to the next slide. So we talked a little bit about why we think this is a bad idea, and why we would say if you don't have cameras in your shelter, please don't do that. We think that it's probably a bad idea. Those are the unintended consequences, but there are people who already do have cameras in their shelters, and so we want to also give you some ideas of how you can take precautions if you already have cameras in your shelter. So let's go to the next slide. We need to adhere to confidentiality standards. So you need to think about VAWA, FIPSA, state laws, etc. And just because a video has been recorded does not mean that it can be shared without adhering to all the confidentiality mandates in the federal law. So for instance, if evidence of a crime was captured on video, your agency would still need the permission of all survivors on the video, even if they weren't involved in the crime at all. So if there was just somebody that was tangentially around, but someone was a victim of a crime and that person wanted to press charges, you would still need the permission of every survivor on the video to turn it over to law enforcement. And any recording that you're required to hand over would still need to be scrubbed of all other individuals if they did not give their permission for that to be handed over. So not only is it difficult, actually pretty nearly impossible to scrub those videos, it may also not be allowed due to evidentiary issues. Just because if the video is tampered with, even if to only remove parts of the video that don't include a client, it could affect the quality of the evidence and possibly hurt the survivor or the person who's been harmed by the crime. So just be mindful of that and highly aware that you have to adhere to those confidentiality standards, that possession of a video, even if evidence of a crime is captured, it does not absolve you of needing to adhere to your confidentiality standards. You don't get to waive those just because you possess something that may be evidence of a crime. So let's go to the next slide. Also, we have to consider client records. So as we mentioned before, this is considered, it can be considered and likely is considered personally identifying information because personally identifying information is anything that can link an individual to to their record, right? So somebody's face is probably personally identifying information because it identifies who they are. And usually we say, oh, it's their name, it's their date of birth, their social security number. Well, their image is probably part of that. So thinking about how some funders, including state administrators of federal funds, have become really strict in recent years on what constitutes a client record and how those records should be maintained. So video surveillance may actually qualify as part of that record, and you may have to maintain that now and have to follow the rules for what needs to be maintained. So you need to know what you must keep and for how long. And so you need to follow up if you're going to do this, and you are doing this, you need to follow up with your state administrators or your funders, your grant monitors, to find out what you have to keep and for how long, and what you must store and label, and how you label this as part of the client record. That's really important. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So there's also this aspect of attorney-client privilege. If an attorney visits a client in shelter, and we realize that this is probably rare, but it still happens. So if an attorney does visit a client in shelter, your recording could actually shatter that attorney-client privilege, because the only time attorney-client privilege exists is when there's no third party there. So it's imperative that the cameras be turned off during the visit. So that just makes sure that the attorney and the client are the only ones that are in that room or in that visit, because if the cameras are there, anything that's said within that visit could actually be subpoenaed. That camera information could be subpoenaed. It could potentially be evidence. It can be turned over, and you don't want to be the one who's compromising that. You don't want to be the put in that position. Your agency doesn't want to be put in that position. Let's go to the next slide. So thinking about considerations, again, it's complicated. We really want you to consider whether it's worth the risk, whether it's worth the workload, because as you all think about this, like, your work as advocates is about connecting folks to resources, right? Like, we're supposed to be helping our clients get the resources they need, connect to the appropriate sources to gain their power and control back, right? To empower them. Is this part of that work that you really want, on your plate? And what do you really gain by that? If surveillance cameras inside the shelter or if the surveillance cameras are inside the shelter, do they really maintain that power, survivor power and control over their own information? Do they really encourage survivor autonomy? Or could really good safety planning do that? Could we do that with powerful safety planning and just empowering our survivors a lot more? If you want to consider, we're asking if you are considering video surveillance. We're just asking that you maybe be in touch with the Action Alliance with your questions so that we can talk you through this and have some discussions around like what this might look like. So now it's time for questions. And I know this is actually kind of a shorter time period. We know that we thought we might have a more robust time for questions. So I want to open it up to you all to see like what questions you have and what thoughts you might want to bring that came up for you in this.
And
So feel free to unmute yourself or chat in the chat box or whatever else.
And this is Kristen. I just wanted to say that we don't have anything scheduled yet on the calendar, but stay tuned. As far as safety planning goes, we should be having a webinar on that coming up from a couple of our folks within the next couple of months, probably closer to a few weeks. But yeah, please stay tuned. And if you want more information on that, please feel free to reach out to us.
So what questions do you all have?
Hi, this is Joy with New Direction Center. One of the questions I have is basically if we don't have the cameras, what can we use for security in place of the cameras? How do we ensure the safety and security of the shelter property, the shelter residents, the staff, without the cameras there?
Yeah, Joy, that's a really good question, and thank you for asking it. I will say that what a lot of shelters have done is to put some cameras on the outside of the shelter to make sure that there's some kind of surveillance outside, because the outside is not the problem, right? It's the inside of the shelter that is the problem. There are some, you might want to consider whether outside shelters, violate some folks' privacy, right? If it's like at the main entrance, does it violate people coming in and out? So you're going to want to ask those questions. But a lot of folks will put those cameras outside because that reasonable expectation of privacy doesn't exist with the external as much as it does with the internal. So some folks have opted to do that. And then but other folks have opted for no security cameras. And what they do is they do this, really strong safety planning, and they make sure that folks know, that we're going to have a plan for different scenarios. And, what are we worried about? What do we think is going to happen? And then they have advocates, their mobile advocates go through and make sure that they're checking on shelters. They're working through different scenarios of how to, make sure they're checking on their property. And those are some other options that they've come up with. Let's see. Kristen, do you have any other thoughts, or Laurel as well? Because Laurel, you've interacted with some of our programs as well on this.
That actually does cover it for me from what I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I was thinking about basically what you were getting at the end there, Amanda, about like these ideas of like community agreements and having really good ideas and plans for what happens when those kinds of things are violated. And even presenting those in ways that aren't like punishment focused, but accountability focused rather, because I think a lot of the use of security cameras comes from like fear of something going wrong. And then it's like, well, now we know what went wrong, and we can like, potentially kick someone out of shelter if we need to, but even that is still like a potentially problematic situation as well. So
And so one more thing that I don't know that we've specifically touched on, but whenever we are collecting files, it's important to have that discussion about like how long are the files going to be stored, where are they going to be stored. Um, so even if we do choose to go the camera route, even if it's just outside, it may be helpful to make sure that there's discussion within the agency about expectations for how long you keep those records.
Right. And I would say if you're doing an outside, you know, cameras, I would, you know, recommending looking at, you know, what is the, having a really strong policy around what is the purpose, and then how do we determine what, you know, what constitutes video we keep versus what constitutes video we don't need to keep. And probably the comings and goings of survivors is video you don't want to keep. Joy, does that answer your question?
I think it does.
Okay, great. What other questions do you all have?
I'm also seeing somebody join us. Welcome. I don't know if this is actually Tina or somebody who's logging in with that name. But just as a reminder, we will be sharing the recording and the slides afterwards.
Hi, Tina, welcome. Any other questions you all have? Or did we cover everything? I'm happy to give you all time back if we did cover everything. Okay, well, let's go to the next. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just I don't know, I'm curious about like any specific times you all can think of where shelters have had issues because of the surveillance cameras.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And honestly, I haven't heard of anything yet, but what I like to focus on is the proactive instead of
Right,
trying to be reactive, right?
right,
So when it comes to privacy issues, my goal is, and confidentiality is always to think about, again, how do we give power and control? How do we make sure the survivor has the most power and control? And if we're being reactive, then we've already taken away power and control from the survivor. So if we can think about ways to be proactive and not ever get into those situations, then that's the most promising, because that means if we never hear about these issues, then that means that, you know, hopefully nobody's rights have been violated, nobody's privacy has been violated. You know, I know that's not the case, right? We just haven't heard about it yet. Probably something has happened, we just don't know about it yet. But chances are the reason that I got information from our national TA provider, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, is because somebody heard about something, right? And so, you know, what we want to do is just be really proactive in our stance and make sure that we are being the most empowering advocates that we can be.
thank you.
Thanks for asking that question.
I'm also trying to put these in chat for folks who prefer a visual reference point, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, so feel free to,
Thank you.
yeah, correct me if there's anything in there that isn't captured well.
No, that's really good. Thank you. Well, let's go to the next slide, because this has my contact information. And again, if you all think of any other questions, please interrupt me. I'm happy for that. But this is my contact information. And actually, Kristen, can you put this in the chat? I'm going to go ahead and give you guys my cell phone number too, and it's fine to record this, but it's 804-337-1912, and that's the number that I use when I'm working from home mostly. But if you leave me a message on this work number, it'll reach me. It takes a little bit longer. So, but if you call me on my cell phone at 804-337-1912, you'll reach me faster. I mean, email is a really quick way to get me as well. So please feel free to email me or call me with any questions that you might have. Again, I know Tina, you came in a little bit late, but that's okay. We're gonna send you all the slides and the recording, as well as a document that we put together, a while back. So making sure that you all have some good information on this. And I'll just throw it out there one more time for questions. Otherwise, it's a short webinar. Well, good. Well, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you all about this. And I hope you all had I hope it was informative to you all. Again, for those of you who are out of state, please look up the laws in your state, because it's really important that you understand what those, consent laws, if your party's a one state consent or two party consent, if you are recording, because you do need to understand, what kind of laws are there around video, audio, and then audio plus video, because they are different across different states. So make sure you understand that, make sure you know what you're doing when it comes to that, if you do already have surveillance cameras within your shelter, because Virginia's different than every other state. And again, if you have questions, please give me a call or shoot me an email. Happy to talk to anybody. And we're going to go ahead and stop the recording now.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm happy to stay on the line for anybody that